Torment. This set, released in 2002, has a pretty insane set gimmick. It's all about the color black. That's right, Torment was intentionally designed to be unbalanced so that the color black could really shine. You can see this just by looking at the set's card breakdown by color. It has 40 black cards, 28 each for blue and red, and 21 each for green and white. But the focus on black doesn't even end there. That's because 23 of the non-black cards in the set have the word black or swamp in the text box or have a black activated ability. In addition to being notable for this unique gimmick, Torment also happens to be a really powerful set, as this video will attest. Every single card on it is still being actively played right now, more than 2 decades after the set was released, so Torment has had a lasting effect on Magic the Gathering. To be eligible for this list, a card had to receive its original printing in Torment. In all, there were 142 cards eligible, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like Regional Championships. At number 10, it's Cabal Coffers. A great example of the set's focus on black. Cabal Coffers is a land with an activated ability that costs 2 generic and you tap it, and you get 1 black mana for each swamp you control. So initially, the Coffers can be pretty bad at generating mana, but by the mid to late game it can produce absurd amounts of mana, provided you're playing a deck that is mono black or close to it. Mono black control decks were highly successful in Block Constructed, thanks in large part to the Coffers. While the deck was less dominant in Standard, it also did some work in that format too. However, after rotating out of the format, the Coffers went idle for almost 2 decades. It just wasn't strong enough in Extended, Legacy, or Vintage, which had better options for going crazy with mana. However, Modern Legal Reprint in Modern Horizons 2 has led to a major renaissance for the Coffers, and now mono-black control decks are a thing in Modern too. The Coffers are particularly spicy alongside Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth since it turns the Coffers into a swamp, meaning that it can tap for mana normally if necessary, and the Coffers will count itself when you activate its ability. Urborg also lets you run more non-basic lands than you would otherwise be able to. The Coffers are going to keep putting up points going forward, and it's got a great shot at moving up the list, but every card on it is active. At number 9, it's Cephalid Illusionist. For 1 generic and a blue, it's a 1/1, and whenever it becomes a target of a spell or ability, you put the top 3 cards of your library into the graveyard. Even Torment cards that aren't black and don't directly reference black tend to have effects related to the graveyard, which is of course part of black's identity more than any other color. Anyway, you can also pay 2 generic and a blue and tap it to prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to and dealt by target creature you control, but it's that first part that has led to the Illusionist seeing so much play. If you can find a way to target for free repeatedly, you can just dump your whole library into your graveyard, and pretty early too. Decks that do this, often called Cephalid Breakfast, first found success in Extended, where you could play a turn 1 Nomads and Core, a turn 2 Illusionist, and use the Nomad's ability to target the Illusionist as many times as you wanted to. While the ability redirects damage, you can choose to target the Illusionist with it at any time, not only when damage is occurring. You could also just repeatedly equip it with Shuko to mill your whole library, so it was surprisingly consistent. Once you milled your whole library, you could reanimate a huge sutured ghoul with a dragon breath attached to it, and end the game on the spot. After finding that brief success in Extended, the combo also transitioned to Legacy, but then went dormant for a super long time until 2019, when Cephalid Breakfast was born again, thanks to Thassa's Oracle, which rewards you for milling your whole library by automatically winning you the game when it enters the battlefield. Right now, Cephalid Breakfast decks are still racking up top finishes in Legacy, and they even got a recent new tool in Nadu Winged Wisdom, which also likes to be targeted repeatedly, so the Illusionist is likely to move even higher on the list in the future. At number 8, it's Mesmeric Fiend. For 1 generic and a black, it's a 1/1, and when it enters, your opponent shows you their hand and you exile a card from it. And when the Fiend leaves the battlefield, the exiled card gets returned to their hand. While it's a bit of a bummer that your opponent can get the card back, the fact it gets exiled also means your opponent can't pull off any graveyard shenanigans with it, and that really matters. 2-mana 1/1s that have discard or discard-like effects almost always see some play, as it's just great to add a body to the board while derailing your opponent's game plan. It was played alongside Cabal Coffers and mono black control decks in both block and standard, but it was also played in a variety of black decks in extended, including Reanimator and Aggro, and in Legacy it's been played in rock decks. It even gained a few points in Legacy sideboards earlier this year. It's been the most successful though in Pauper, a format where only commons are legal. In that format, the Mesmeric Fiend trigger is often abused. If you play the Fiend and exile a card from your opponent's hand, and then sacrifice the Fiend to something like Makeshift Munitions, the Fiend leaves the battlefield, so the return the card part triggers before the exile from their hand trigger does, so they never get their card back. The Fiend is well positioned to continue to put up top finishes in both Legacy and Pauper in the future. At number 7, it's Basking Rootwalla. For 1 green mana, it's a 1/1, and you can pay 1 generic and a green to give it +2/+2 until end of turn, and you can only use that ability once per turn. It also has Madness for 0 mana, and that means when you discard it, you can just cast it for free, which is amazing. Madness was originally introduced in Torment, and it's definitely a black-tinted mechanic since it involves you discarding your own cards for value. The Rootwalla was the cornerstone of block, standard, and extended decks in the early 2000s that specialized in efficiently discarding cards and casting them for their Madness cost. When Survival of the Fittest was legal in Legacy, it was played there too. Discarding the Rootwalla and casting it for free while tutoring up a creature is a very powerful play, but of course Survival got banned in Legacy in 2011. Basking Rootwalla went idle for about a decade until its younger sibling came along in 2021's Modern Horizons, Blazing Rootwalla. Like its Basking relative, it also has Madness for 0. The two Rootwallas have helped propel Bazaar of Baghdad aggro decks to the top of Tier 1 in Vintage. The Bazaar is a land that lets you draw 2 cards and then discard 3 cards. Obviously this means if you discard some Rootwallas, you can just plop them into play on turn 1, and the deck's ability to take advantage of all that discard doesn't end there, as the Rootwallas can easily be joined by Hollow Ones and Vengevines. The strength of these decks is that they can quickly assemble damage on the board, and Basking Rootwalla is likely to continue to put up impressive finishes in Vintage. At number 6, it's Chainer's Edict. For 1 generic and a black, it's a sorcery that makes target players sacrifice a creature. It also has flashback for 5 generic and 2 black, which means you can cast it from the graveyard for that cost and then exile it. Edicts aren't always great at removing your opponent's best creature, but if they only have a single creature, it tends to be pretty great. And because it's a sacrifice effect, you can even get around hexproof and indestructible. And of course, because it has flashback, you can even mill it or discard it and get value out of it when it's in the graveyard. It saw lots of play in block, standard, and extended. These days it sees a ton of play in Pauper, where hexproof decks like to put lots of auras on a single creature. Chainer's Edict is going to continue to put up top finishes in Pauper going forward. At number 5, it's Circular Logic. It's an instant for 2 generic and a blue, and it counters a spell unless its controller pays 1 generic for each card in your graveyard. It also has Madness for a single blue mana. So, if you've got a deck that is good at discarding cards and loading the graveyard, 2 things that are often very much related to one another, Circular Logic can be an insanely absurd counterspell. Both the block and standard it was legal in were all about getting cards in the graveyard one way or another between the Madness and Threshold mechanics. Both Madness and Threshold decks, as well as Psychotog decks, could really abuse Circular Logic. It was the most formidable in the last of those, as Psychotog decks were control decks that abused Madness as much as possible, as they discarded cards to load up their graveyard and pump their Psychotog. Eventually, the graveyard would get so large that Psychotog could go for lethal in a single swing. At Worlds in 2002, all 8 of the top 8 decks ran Circular Logic, so I guess you could say it was a pretty key card in Standard. Psychotog and Madness decks also transitioned well to Extended, and Circular Logic was also good alongside the Dredge mechanic, so it picked up a few points there too. More recently, it's been played in Pauper Tireless Tribe decks, which are basically the Pauper version of Psychotog, since the deck uses a creature with a free discard ability as its win condition. Like the other cards on the list, Circular Logic is going to keep putting up top finishes in the future. At number 4, it's Cabal Ritual. You can't have a black focus set without throwing in a callback to Dark Ritual, right? For 1 generic and a black, it's an instant that adds 3 black to your mana pool, but if you have Threshold, which means you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, it adds 5 black mana instead. Obviously, if you can load your graveyard quickly, this gives you an insane mana boost. As powerful as that type of effect can be, you do really need to be able to do something insanely strong for a ritual to be worth it, since you actually 2-for-1 yourself if you just use it to cast a spell normally. For that reason, the ritual didn't see play in block or standard, and it took a few years for it to catch on in any format, but since 2007 it's been played in Storm decks in multiple formats. Cards with Storm make a copy of themselves for each other spell cast before them in a turn, and Storm decks are all about casting a whole bunch of ritual and card draw effects so that you can get your Storm count high enough that you can just win the game with something like Tendrils of Agony. These decks also get Threshold during one of those turns because they cast so many spells. Storm decks have been viable in Legacy and Vintage for a very long time at this point, and Cabal Ritual frequently makes appearances in those decks. At number 3, it's Ichorid. For 3 generic and a black, it's a 3/1 with haste, and you sacrifice it at the end of your turn, and at the beginning of your upkeep, if it's in your graveyard, you can exile a black creature other than Ichorid from the graveyard, and if you do, you return Ichorid to the battlefield. So basically, if your deck is constructed correctly, you can send Ichorid, and usually multiple Ichorids, at your opponent every turn for no mana at all, and they hit hard enough that your opponent can be dead in a hurry. It hardly saw any play in Block or Standard, as there just weren't that many ways to load your graveyard quickly enough. However, Ichorid benefited greatly from the introduction of the dredge mechanic in original Ravnica. Now it was easy to load up your graveyard for free, and as a result, Ichorid decks ran wild in Extended, especially in 2008. And it's continued to be a key card in dredge decks in both Legacy and Vintage, where it's pretty easy to dump huge chunks of your library into the graveyard, and in Vintage especially, you can easily send multiple Ichorids at your opponent on turn 2. Ichorid's going to continue to amass top 8s in the Eternal formats. At number 2, it's Deep Analysis. For 3 generic and a blue, it's a sorcery that draws 2 cards, and it has flashback for 1 generic and a blue, and you pay 3 life. The fact you have to pay life shows you that this blue card is a little blacker than most. Anyway, while paying 4 to draw 2 is below rate, the fact that you can cast this again from the graveyard for so little mana is a pretty big deal, and it also means you can just mill it or discard it and cast it at that extreme discount. In Block and Standard, it saw play in Madness decks, which could discard it for free with a number of cards like Wild Mongrel, and then cast it from the graveyard. In Standard and Extended, it saw play in the aforementioned Psychotog decks. In Legacy, it sees play in Doomsday decks, which shrink their deck to 5 cards with the eponymous sorcery, and then try to win with Thassa's Oracle. Deep Analysis is a pretty nice card to put on top, since if you have the mana, you can just draw the remaining 4 cards using it alone. It also used to see some play in Vintage, but doesn't have any points in that format for a while. It recently got a reprint in Modern Horizons 3, making it legal in Modern for the first time, and it's already seeing some play in the format, and it's been heavily played in Pauper for quite a while, since in terms of the number of cards it can draw you, it's one of the most potent cards in the format. Deep Analysis is going to continue to add to its score in Pauper, Modern, and Legacy in the future, but it has quite a ways to go to catch the number 1 card on the list, which is Grim Lavamancer. It's kind of funny that despite the black focus of this set, the top 2 cards on the list don't have a black identity at all, although as I've noted throughout the video, even the cards that are on this list that aren't technically black have a bit of black flavor. And that's true of the Lavamancer too, since it's a red creature that loves the graveyard. For 1 red mana, it's a 1/1, and you can pay 1 red mana, tap the Lavamancer, and exile 2 cards from your graveyard to do 2 damage to any target. So if you're good at loading your graveyard, this gives you a repeatable source of damage that can pick off small creatures or go after your opponent, and it turns out being able to cast Shock every single turn without using up a card is a huge deal. Over the years, it's seen play in every format it's ever been legal in, including in aggressive red decks like Burn and Red Deck Wins, and more controlling blue-red decks that run Delver of Secrets. In both decks, you cast lots of cheap spells, so the Lavamancer has plenty of fuel. It has slowed down some in recent years. It was once pretty much a staple in Modern, but that hasn't been true for a while, but it's still putting up points in multiple formats today, so it has a good chance at remaining the number 1 card on the list for the foreseeable future. So, those are the top 10 cards from Torment. Overall, I think it's safe to say that this set was very strong. If you're interested in owning the best cards from such a strong set, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at specific sets, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.